Okay, we're live, and today I just wanted to get into the poets, which is Surah 26. I just wanted to begin this, begin analyzing this surah. And the title itself is interesting because Islam is a very freighted relationship with poetry, even though Muhammad himself plagiarized like much of the Quran, he plagiarized a good deal of pre-existing Arabic poetry and copied it like most things badly. He kind of a second-hand ersatz version, but using the same stylistic flourishes of Arab poets who existed at the time. Even though he he used Arabic poetry, he also had a strong hatred not only for the people who pointed this out, and there were contemporaneous witnesses, and you even notice this in the Quran, people who are accusing him of plagiarizing, of stealing. This is literally laid out inside of the Quran itself, which is ironic when you see him using this as a means of demonizing his opponents when in fact they're speaking the truth. So even in the Quran itself, you noticed you become aware of the fact that Muhammad stole from Arabic poetry, Arabic Arabic Arab poets, and the Arabian prophet Christian Prince has a great channel where he live streams sometimes 2 3 times a day. And if you check out his channel, you'll find that he actually has videos explaining this and comparing, kind of like how you see apologists. Sometimes they have teaching videos where they use Duolingo and Bible reading software to cross reference things. He'll do that and use the Quran and point out the examples of Muhammad plagiarizing Arabic poetry. So, but even though he did this, he had a very inimical relationship with poets. In fact, several poets were put to death because they criticized Muhammad repeatedly. And this is something that persisted throughout Islamic history, despite the fact that Islam has a long history of wine poetry. Very famous poets like Abu Nawas. These people were often in the crosshairs of the caliph and sometimes were exiled. Sometimes they were even killed, like the poets who criticized Muhammad. So this Surah, the poets, it's an interesting choice, and we'll be going over going over certain aspects of this. It begins, of course, with a benediction of sorts in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, Ta Sin Mim, and this is the disjointed letters, the disjointed letters that you find in maybe 25% of the surahs. They don't make any sense, and even Islamic scholars can't correctly explain to you what exactly they mean. But you see them repeatedly throughout the Quran, and it belies the notion that the Quran is a perfect Arabic book because you have words that are occasionally you'll see Greco-Roman um, words that have a Greco-Roman origin, but also a lot of Persian roots and stems and words make their appearance in the Quran. So the idea that it's a perfect, completely Arabic book, even if you accept the kind of bizarre Muslim notion that God speaks a specific language, even if you accept that premise, the Quran fails to meet that standard when you look at these things like the disjointed letters. So it begins with that, and then on to verse 2, it says, "These are the verses of the book that makes parentheses things clear." And it's interesting that this is in parentheses because um, obviously that's a parenthetical note, an indication that the Quran is not clear. And what does it make clear? Things. Well, what are things? Presumably the Quran. So it makes it the Quran is a book that makes the Quran clear, or the lessons of the Quran clear, even though, as we've noticed throughout the more than the nearly 2 dozen videos that I've made so far in the Quran read through, it doesn't make anything clear. If anything, reading the Quran only complicates matters and makes things more confusing. Hello, love and light. I'm glad you're here. And the other for the other 3 people that are here, thanks for watching. Feel free to share this with anyone who needs some information about Islam, or the historiography of Muhammad, or the history of the Quran. So in 4, it says, if we please, we should send down upon them a sign from heaven, so that their necks should stoop to it, and there does not come to them a new reminder from the beneficent God, but they turn aside from it. Again, this is Muhammad making excuses for the fact that there's no evidence that he was a prophet. This is a self-attested prophet who had no signs that he was a prophet. Every other prophet, whether it's Elijah or Elisha, his disciple, or Haggai, or Obadiah, or any of the prophets throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament, throughout the Old Testament, John the Baptist, Jesus himself, any other prophet was confirmed by God, whereas Muhammad assumes a prophethood that he takes for himself, and he provides no evidence. So throughout the Quran, you're consistently seeing Muhammad saying, well, if you want a sign, God would have given you a sign, but you're disbelievers, saying things along those lines. And this is just an evidence. Again, this is an idea that's taken in part from the Bible. For example, Jesus says, you ask for a sign, and the only sign that will be given to you is the sign of Jonas. In other words, Jesus will spend 3 days in the earth and then be resurrected. But the thing is, Jesus actually was resurrected. There was a resurrection. Plus, he said this to Pharisees who he had already displayed signs and wonders to, because Israel had been conditioned to accept prophets based on them performing miraculous events. So during during the time, that's right, Khadijah had to convince him that he wasn't suffering a mental breakdown, that he hadn't experienced demons. Him and I think his brother-in-law, they were the ones that persuaded him. It's kind of sad because Muhammad was initially, he had the right idea. He had an encounter with a demon, or at the very least had a psychotic episode. He realized that this wasn't an angel, because when people encounter angels, you saw this with Manoah, with Mary, the mother of Jesus. All of these people, of course, when they encounter angels, they're shocked, and initially they're fearful, because encountering something from heaven is a transformative experience, and it particularly when you encounter the angel of the Lord, it brings to light the fact that you're a sinful person, and it's shocking. But they very quickly are reassured, and they realize that this angel was sent to them not to doom them, but to give them a revelation of some sort. And Muhammad, that's not what happened to Muhammad. Muhammad said that the angel, quote unquote, Jibril, who initially he didn't believe was an angel, he thought was a demon, squeezed him 3 times, and subsequent to this, he tried to kill himself. So obviously, this was not an encounter with an angel, but Muhammad was persuaded otherwise. But in 53, it says, and he it is who has made 2 seas to flow freely, the one that subdues thirst by sweetness, and the other salt that burns by saltness. And between the 2, he has made a barrier and an inviolable obstruction. And as I explained to you, Muhammad didn't understand science. He thought there was a literal barrier a wall that God had separating the oceans, say the Atlantic Ocean, from rivers and from fresh water. And he it is who created man from the water. Then he has made for him blood, relationship, and marriage relationship, and your Lord is powerful. And this is used by Muslims sometimes to indicate that Muhammad had some understanding, some unusual or unique understanding of science. The fact that he realized that humans' anatomy was it was composed of water. And the thing is, Muhammad did not understand science. Repeatedly he repeatedly said things, even scientific discoveries that had already been made. For example, the idea that this was not a geocentric universe, that the world was not flat, even though these were things that had been discovered, even though they were not the main consensus view at the time. These were things that had been adduced by scientists, and Muhammad got it completely wrong. He also believed that semen was made by the vertebrae, that your backbone was what created sperm, and these wouldn't be that bad. You could just attribute it to Muhammad being an ignorant, 7th century Arab caravan trader. But the problem is that Muslims believe this is the revealed truth. This is something created divinely by Allah, whom they consider God. And when you just look at a few of these very glaring errors, you realize that the Quran was not created by God, because God obviously is omniscient and he understands science. A lot of atheists like Steven Pinker, a lot of atheist scientists like Steven Pinker and Sam Harris and others will say, well, it's impossible for the Bible to be correct because there are these things in the Bible that contradict physical laws. And what they don't understand is that physical laws are subject to God. Yes, these miracles are unusual, but they're perfectly plausible. I mean, they could happen if God deems it, because things like the law of thermodynamics and the law of gravity, Kepler's laws of motion, all of these things, all of these laws were created by God, and they're subject to God's will. But in the Quran, where you have things that we know now are completely scientifically incorrect, like the idea that that we live in a geocentric universe, or that semen is created in someone's vertebrae, we know now that these are completely scientifically incorrect, and that the reason they're in the Quran is because Muhammad was an ignorant person who wasn't aware of astronomy or embryology or basic science. That's why they're in the Quran. So it's a little bit different from describing a miraculous event that God effectuated. The Quran isn't wrong because it describes miraculous events, even though the events it describes, like the night journey, obviously did not happen. It's not wrong because miracles are not possible. It's wrong because it describes things that simply are not so. So in 54, when it says man was created from water, this again is just Muhammad not understanding. He's referring to Adam here. So at different points in the Quran, it says Adam is created from water, from dirt, from soil, from a clot of blood. And again, it's just exposing the contradictions within the Quran. And in 56, it says, we have not sent you but as a giver of good news and as a warner. As I explained in a previous video, the Quran is not good news. It's the complete opposite of good news, whereas the gospel actually is good news because it's the news of salvation. Um, yeah, the verse about setting in murky water in my translation of the Quran, it says see, uh, because this is not the best translation of the Quran. Obviously, Muslims would say any sort of translation is a corruption, which means that anyone who doesn't speak classical Arabic is not able to become a Muslim. So it's kind of an indictment of their own position. But mine is kind of a bad translation, but it's a bad translation in the sense that it gives the benefit of the doubt to Muhammad, and it tries to paint a glossy picture of Islam. It's not trying to paint a bad picture of Islam. This was printed by an American offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So obviously they're trying to make Islam sound better than it is. So it says set in a murky in the sea instead of a murky puddle or murky water. But the funny thing is that's just as ridiculous when you think about it, because the sun does not. That's not what a sunset is. A sun does not submerge. It doesn't matter if it's a puddle or the Atlantic, the Pacific Ocean. The sun cannot. Yeah, exactly. It's still wrong. It doesn't matter which it is. Both are equally wrong in a sense. Just because setting in a puddle sounds more ridiculous, it doesn't make it any less ridiculous than the idea that the sun sets in the ocean. That's not what the sun is doing. When you see the sunset, it's not setting. It's not being submerged in water. But Muhammad believed that it was. So in 61, again, we have the same problem. Blessed is he who made the constellations in the heavens, and here he's referring to Allah, and made therein a lamp and a shining moon. So again, Muhammad, and even this is embarrassing when you bring this up to Muslims who actually purport to believe in the Quran. They've tried to invent um, all sorts of amusing ways to evade the stupidity of the Quran. They'll say, "Oh, well, this is metaphorical." He does, but no. Muhammad is literally saying the moon shines, and this is because he didn't understand that the moon does not have an internal light source. When we see the moon, it's simply um, reflecting the rays of the sun. And this is one of the reasons when Muhammad saw a lunar eclipse, he thought it was the apocalypse, because he did not understand. He did not understand that the Earth revolves around the sun, and that the moon, that the moon is a satellite of the Earth, and that the moon, when you see the moon, it's not reflecting its own light. That's not that's not what it's doing. So when he says the shining moon, this is simply him not understanding astronomy. And he it is who made the night and the day to follow each other, for him who desires to be mindful of the desires to be thankful. And I explained in another video how Muhammad thought that he didn't understand night and day, and because he didn't have a fundamental understanding of the Earth's relationship to the sun and the moon. And the servants of the beneficent God are they who walk on the earth in humbleness, and when the ignorant address them, they say peace. And again, this is something that was taken, a concept that was taken from the Bible. You can see it in Psalms, in the book of Isaiah. Say peace, but they mean war. And it's being misapplied by Muhammad in this case. And in 67 it says, and they who when they spend are neither extravagant nor parsimonious, and keep between these the just mean. And again, the idea of the golden mean, there's virtually nothing in the Quran that wasn't plagiarized from another source. Gnosticism, Nestorianism, Sabianism, various polytheistic religions, uh, uh, Arabic folk tales and poetry, and the rest of it is simply Muhammad's own really bizarre personal thoughts. So it's basically someone who's psychologically disturbed, who's mentally ill, and might have been possessed by demons. Him grafting his own weird thoughts and desire to attain power onto a whole grab bag of pre-existing philosophies and religions, and those philosophies being distorted through the prism of Muhammad. That's basically what the Quran is. I don't know if Muhammad had epilepsy. There's good evidence that he had. He might have had some neurological disorders, which some people claim that he had mental disorders that stem from this. I don't know if he had epilepsy. I know Julius Caesar. People think that Julius Caesar, in retrospect, might have had epilepsy, but I'm not sure about Muhammad. It's possible. It's possible, though, when you look at some of the things, some of the events that he described in his own life, in his own, it's possible he may have suffered from certain neurological conditions that weren't diagnosable at the time. So, but to continue on this point, oh, okay. In 18, it says Furon. Okay, so here it describes the poet. So it describes, coming from here, it describes the interaction between Pharaoh and Aaron and Moses for about the next 20 or so, or 30 verses, and this is where Muhammad takes certain ideas from Exodus and embroiders upon them and uses them for his own bizarre storytelling. So in 17:18 it says, Pharaoh, who is the Pharaoh, said, "Did we not bring you up as a child among us, and you tarried among us for many years of your life, and you did that deed of yours which you did, and you ate, and you did that deed, and you ate one of the ungrateful?" He said, "I did it while I was one of those unable to see the right course, so I fled from you. When I feared you, then my Lord granted me wisdom and made me one of the apostles. And is it a favor of which you remind me that you have enslaved the children of Israel?" So he's describing Moses growing up, becoming an adult, and deciding to cast his lot with his fellow Jews, and to abandon the heritage of being raised within the Pharaoh's family as a baby, being taken in a bulrush and raised by the Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, "And what is the Lord of the worlds?" Now, this actually is a pretty accurate rendering of the conversation. This part of the conversation, at least between Pharaoh and Moses, because Pharaoh asked him, "Who is this God? This God that you serve?" And obviously, Pharaoh was completely completely unwilling to acknowledge God, which is why he he was subjected, and Egypt was subjected to a series of plagues. And eventually Pharaoh relented and let them leave, and then of course, the Exodus uh, took place. So this is actually a pretty accurate rendering of what of that interaction, this part of that interaction. Um, Pharaoh said to those around him, "Do you not hear?" He said, "Your Lord and the Lord of your fathers of old." Said he, "Most surely your apostle who is sent to you is mad." He said, "The Lord of the east and the west and what is between them, if you understand." Said he, "If you will take a god besides me, I will most certainly make you one of the imprisoned." He said, "What? Even if I bring you something manifest?" Said he, "Bring it then, if you are of the untruthful ones." So he cast down his rod, and lo, it was an obvious serpent. And he drew forth his hand, and lo, it appeared white to the onlookers. Pharaoh said to and again here, Muhammad is conflating because he didn't understand. He didn't actually have an understanding of the Bible, of the Torah, even though he references the Torah repeatedly and the Injil, the Gospel. He didn't actually have an understanding of these books. He didn't sit down and read them. So he conflates several different events that occurred in the story of in the book of Exodus. He conflates them into one and compresses them into one conversation. So Moses Moses when God was demonstrating to Moses how he would lead his people, and one of the signs he shows is Moses taking Moses' arm and afflicting it with leprosy, and him pulling it back, and then he takes his arm again and he removes the leprosy. So he inserts this into the dialogue with Pharaoh, and it continues. He in 38. So the magicians were gathered together at the appointed time on the fixed day, and it was said to the people, "Will you gather together? Happily we may follow the magicians if they are the vanquishers." And when the magicians came, they said to Pharaoh, "Shall we get a reward if we are the vanquishers?" He said, "Yes, and surely you will then be one of those who made near." Musa said to them, "Cast what you are going to cast." And he continues, then Musa cast down his staff, and lo, it swallowed up the lies they told. And the magicians were thrown down prostrate. They said, "We believe in the Lord of worlds, the Lord of Musa and Harun." And again, this is something that Muhammad completely fabricated. During the story, the magicians see that Moses is an emissary of God, and they see the signs and wonders. In this case, his rod turning into a serpent and swallowing their rods, which actually did occur. And then they repent and become followers of Allah. Again, this is something that Muhammad just completely fabricated. He didn't. And you see this throughout the Quran. Not only the discontinuities when he's recounting something that's ostensibly from the Torah or from the Gospel, you have these discontinuities and anachronisms, like Mary being related to Mariam, or confusing Mary with Mariam, the sister of Moses. But you also just have things that didn't occur, like the Pharaoh's magicians repenting and deciding to follow Allah. And as I've explained, Allah and Islam, these were Allah existed in the Arabian Peninsula. It was a pagan. It was the chief deity of the pagan Arabs in that area, and Muhammad grafted his ideas onto a pre-existing religion. But this was something that did not exist in ancient Egypt and was not something that the Jews would be aware of. This idea of turning Moses and Abraham and Isaac and subsequent generations of Jews into Muslims is just Muhammad retconning his beliefs onto onto history, basically. So in 49, it said he, you believe in him before I give you permission. Most surely he is the chief of you who taught you the magic. So you shall know. Certainly I will cut your hands and your feet on opposite sides, and certainly I will crucify you. And this is just an illustration that Muhammad, how 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 synthetic the Quran is, because he imposes punishments that did not exist in ancient Egypt onto the story of Exodus and the encounter between Moses and the Pharaoh. So in ancient Egypt, they did have a punishment where they would mar the person who was being prosecuted or convicted. The person the they would mar their hands, and so it was similar in a sense, but it wasn't cross amputation. So when he says, I will cut off your hands and your feet on opposite sides, this is a punishment that Muhammad implemented, especially when he took over as ruler of Mecca and Arabia. He had non-Muslims and people who were political dissidents and Christians and Jews, he had them executed through crucifixion and cross amputation. And this is a key punishment within Islam. And you see it even today in Saudi Arabia. They've crucified dozens of people just in the past year and executed hundreds, over 1,000, I believe. And it's a key part of Sharia and something that's endemic to particularly Saudi Arabia, but Islam in general. They crucify people. This is why you see victims of ISIS, who are kidnapped or taken prisoner. Some of them were burnt alive, like the Jordanian pilot who crashed in ISIS territory. He was immolated, and it was filmed and used as a propaganda video. This is because this is something Muhammad would do. He took one man in order to steal his money and to get information about his jewelry. He set his chest on fire, or his minions did this. His disciples, they set the man's chest on fire until he confessed, and then they murdered him. They executed him. So when you see ISIS doing these things, they're doing them because it's licit in Islam. It's part of the foundation of Islam contained in the Quran, that you can execute people by crucifixion and by cross amputating their hands and by setting them on fire. This is something that you find in the Quran and the Hadith, but it's not something that the Egyptians did. The Egyptians did not, even though crucifixion has existed for thousands of years. It was done by the Macedonians and the Phoenicians, and obviously the Romans crucified thousands of Jews and Jewish followers of Christ. Obviously, Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, was decapitated. They cut his head off because he was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens weren't subject to crucifixion. But they did crucify Jews and others. So there's a history of crucifixion, but the ancient Egyptians did not crucify people, and they did not cross amputate the legs, the feet, and the hands of people, even though they did have a punishment that was somewhat similar, but they marred the prisoner's hands. But these were not punishments that were found in ancient Egypt. So obviously, this is just another instance where Allah, even though He's supposedly all-knowing, did not know that that the Pharaoh would not have threatened to crucify or threatened to cut off the hands of Moses and Aaron, or not them, but the magicians who who worship them. And as I said, this is something that's not in Exodus. This is something that Muhammad completely fabricated. And it just even fabricates a dialogue. They said, "No harm, surely to our Lord we go back. These are the magicians who've repented in the Quran. Surely we hope that our Lord will forgive us our wrongs because we are the first of the believers." And this is something that's completely fictitious. Again, for people, I would recommend that Muslims actually read the second book of Moses. They read Exodus to get the real story and understand what happened instead of relying on the Quran. So, um, again, just to reemphasize this, there was no crucifixion or cross amputation. Ancient Egyptians, there was decapitation, drowning, ironically being burnt alive, which is something that was crystallized in Islam. And this is why you see ISIS burning captives alive, or they did when they had control of a territory. So it goes on to describe the Exodus. Uh, in 63, it says, "Then we," notice it uses the plural pronoun here, "revealed to Musa," and this is referring to Allah, the we, "strike the sea with your staff." So it had cloven asunder, and each part was like a huge mound. And we brought near there the others, and we saved Musa and those with him, all of them. Then we drowned the others. And in 69, it says, "And recite to them the story of Ibrahim when he said to his father and his people, 'What do you worship?' They said, 'We worship idols, so we shall be their votaries.' He said, 'Do they hear you when you call, or do they profit you or cause you harm?' They said, 'Nay, we found our fathers doing so.' He said, 'Have you then considered what you have been worshiping, you and your ancient sires? Surely they are enemies to me, but not so the Lord of the worlds, who created me when he has shown me the way.'" And again, as I showed in the previous video, in Surah 21:58, it says, "So he broke them into pieces." And this is referring to Abraham and the idols, "except the chief of them, that haply they may return to it." So in Surah 26, you have Abraham admonishing his admonishing the people in Ur, the Chaldees, admonishing them for worshiping idols. But 5 surahs previous to this, you have him saying he you have him breaking the idols except for one of the idols. So in other words, except the chief of them. So the chief idol he kept. This is Abraham. Keep in mind that haply they may return to it. So you have Abraham being described as breaking all of the idols except for one idol, which is the chief idol, and asking them and demanding that they worship it. So uh, forward 5 surahs, Surah 26, you have Abraham chiding idol worshippers for worshiping idols. So, I mean, this exposes the contradictions of the Quran, but also the fallacy that that Islam is a monotheistic religion. At best, it's a form of monolatry, such as they had in ancient Egypt, where you would have long periods. For example, under Akhenaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten, you would have long periods where they worshipped God, the god of the sun, and his and Aten, an attribute of this god. So you would call this monolatry. So they had other gods. The Egyptians had many other gods, but they would look to Ra as the chief god and worship him. And you had long periods of Egyptian history where this is and this is a good point. The Quran is not chronological. So yeah, this is not in chronological order. This is how it's arranged from long to short. But the idea is, even so, it exposes the um, it just exposes the deception of the Quran, trying to portray it as a monotheistic religion, which is based on Abrahamic values, when it depicts Abraham as essentially being an idol worshiper. Like I said, it's at the very best monolatry, believing in one chief God. And in this case, the chief god is Allah, which was the chief god of the pagan Arabs. And this is why you see Muhammad trying to worship in the mosque, or the house of worship erected by pagan Arabs. He did not he wanted to worship there, and he did not want to just destroy it and replace it with a monotheistic non-pagan religion. And he which is why the Kaaba predates it predated Muhammad, and it's a quintessentially pagan relic. So here you have a description of Abraham being described as an admonisher of idol worshippers, when in the same book you have him saying, yes, we're going to be idol worshippers, not like the idol worshippers that like you are. We're just going to worship one main idol. And again, this is not monotheism, and it's not who Abraham is depicted. If you go to Genesis, if you go to Genesis 11, where it first talks about Terah and his son Abram, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law. And I'm reading from 11:31, Genesis 11:31. His son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make thee a great nation, make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. So this is a description of what actually happened. Abraham was called out of the land of his fathers, which was a land of idolaters and pagan worshippers, and even his family were idol worshippers. And he was called out of this environment to the land of Canaan, which was the land of promise, and God established a covenant with him and his sons and grandsons and future generations that came from Abram and Sarah. So, and this is a complete contradiction of what you have in the Quran, which is basically Muhammad retconning his own weird beliefs and his life onto the story of Abraham. So what Muhammad did was take a pre-existing polytheistic religion and minimize it so that you would only worship one pagan idol out of all of the pre-existing pagan idols. But the problem is that's still idolatry. That's not monotheism. Reducing the number of gods that you worship, the number of false gods that you worship, to one false god. That's not what monotheism is, and it's not worshiping God. So in 81 it says, and this is still him talking, and he who will cause me to die, then give me life, and who I hope will forgive me my mistakes on the day of judgment. And again, here you have Muhammad depicting Abraham with no internal security, no eternal security, despite the fact that for those of you, most of you have probably read Hebrews 11, and this is colloquially known as the Hall of Faith, and it's a description of all of the patriarchs and the prophets and the men and women who believed in God and believed that God was their salvation, and they put their faith in God and all of the amazing things that they did and the promise that they uh, would eventually inherit, even if they didn't see it in their lifetimes. So Abraham is one of the chief characters in Hebrews 11, and his life is described as a life of faith. Whereas in the Quran, he's depicted as a Muslim, essentially, someone who has no eternal security, has no belief or no faith in God, and his 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 destiny, his eternal destiny, is essentially being decided by a capricious, arbitrary figure named Allah. So in the Quran, even Abraham is not convinced that God is going to uh, welcome him into paradise. Abraham could be in hell. If you're a Muslim and you take the Quran literally, you don't have any idea of whether Abraham is in heaven. Whereas if you read the Bible, you the and you've read the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, you'll understand that paradise, this was during the lifetime of Jesus, was described as Abraham's bosom. So Abraham was was talking to the rich man who was in Hades, and he was talking to him from Abraham's bosom. In other words, paradise. But if you're a Muslim, you don't believe that Abraham was in paradise. Um, you have no idea where Abraham was. Abraham could be where Judas is. He could be in hell, for all you know. And this is one of the probably the main problem, aside from denying the deed of Christ. This is the main problem with Islam. One of many, but a very hard problem to overcome. The idea that there's no eternal security. There's no conviction of your salvation. So in 88 it says the day 87 it says, and disgrace me not on the day when they are raised, the day on which property will not avail, nor sons, except him who comes to Allah with a heart free from evil. And this again is contradicts an example of the contradictions within the Quran, because one of the 6 articles of faith in Islam is predestination. And the way that predestination is conceived in the Quran is as I'm describing it right now. This is basically what predestination is. It's Allah deciding arbitrarily who to damn and who to receive into paradise. There's no volition of any kind in terms of your sin, whether you sin or whether you whether you receive God. There's no people are basically marionettes, and they can be a Muslim, they can observe the 5 pillars of Islam, and yet they can still go to hell. That because there's no eternal security. And this is how Islam conceives of predestination, which is a biblical concept, but it's been distorted beyond recognition in Islam. So here you have something that contradicts one of the articles of Islam, which is predestination, and says, "Except him who comes to Allah with a heart free from evil." And you have this throughout the Quran, this confusion, even though it's a works based salvation, and the soteriology is very focused on achieving your salvation. You also have moments where Allah alludes to the idea that people have some sort of stake in their own salvation, some sort of stake in determining where they ultimately reside, whether or not they spend eternity in hell or spend eternity in paradise. So in 90 it says, "And the garden shall be brought near for those who guard against evil." So and the hell shall be made manifest to the erring ones. So this idea that there's no free will, but at the same time you're responsible for not erring. But even if you do guard yourself from error and from sin, you might still be punished by Allah. And this is you might be still condemned by Allah. And this is the confusion of Islam. When you really break it down, there's so many mutually contradictory concepts, because this was not written by God. The Quran was not written by God. It was written by a man who was very ignorant and conspicuously ignorant of scripture, and didn't have a real relationship with God. So what you get is kind of a hodgepodge of contradictory ideas and just unworkable concepts when you apply it to when you look at it scripturally. So in 99, in 98 it says, "When we made you equal to the Lord of the worlds, and none but the guilty led us astray." So, and in 100 it says, "We have no intercessors," which raises the question: is Muhammad an intercessor? Because you're told repeatedly throughout the Quran to believe in Muhammad, to emulate Muhammad and follow Muhammad because he's an apostle of Allah. But in here, in 100 it says, "So we have no true intercessors nor a true friend, but if we could but once return, we would be of the believers." Now he's describing people who are being condemned after life of not being Muslims and are now begging Allah to have mercy on them. But the idea that there are no intercessors, there is an intercessor. There's one intercessor, which is Jesus Christ, but Muslims refuse to look at him because they have a very skewed, misguided interpretation of who Jesus is. Even though Jesus is described as sinless and is described as a Messiah, he's also described as a man. So Muslims don't understand who Jesus is because they get their impression of Jesus through a book that completely butchers the gospel. So, I mean, there's some aspects of it that are correct. For example, the idea that Jesus is sinless. Yes, he had no sin, and he was the only one who was able to keep the law perfectly. But and he was the Messiah. But at the same time that Muslims are making these claims, they're also denying Jesus's deity. So this is why they believe they have no intercessors, and they have to hope that Allah doesn't condemn them to hell. And yes, Muhammad also said that in other parts of the Quran that Christianity and Judaism were just as Christianity and Judaism were also good, that there were Christians, those who followed Christ, and Christ's disciples are described as having the truth in the Quran. So when you see Muslims who attack Paul, who's an apostle of Christ, um, you have to ask them, why don't they believe the Quran's words, which says that disciples of Christ were had the truth. So in 114, he starts describing Noah. So in 105 it says the people of Noah rejected the apostles when their brother Noah, i.e. Noah, said to them, "Will you not guard against evil? Surely I am a faithful apostle to you." And then it continues in 115, "I am not but a plain warner." They said, "If you desist not, O Nah, you shall most certainly be of those stoned to death." And again, we have the insertion of an Islamic concept, the idea that Noah would be stoned. And stoning, or rahem, was very pivotal to Islam, particularly the early development of Islam. People who disobeyed Muhammad and contradicted him, they would be stoned to death. And this is an inheritance, in some sense, from Jewish law, but the Israel, there have not been actual stonings. In the Pharisees came to Jesus and asked him, trying to entrap him. They came to him with a woman they had entrapped in adultery, and tried to get him to say that she should be stoned in order to impugn his character, or catch him out in a contradiction between Moses and between Moses and his teachings. And of course, he resolved that by pointing out that all the people who were going to stone her also had sins. So, but the idea of stoning people to death, stoning people to death was stoning was a punishment in Semitic culture, and Muhammad was someone who revived this and crystallized it into Islamic culture, which is why you see women and people who are apostates being stoned to death in places like Iran, even or Pakistan, even though oftentimes it's not being carried out officially by the state. There are people who are being stoned to death through extrajudicial methods, and this is something that's part of the Quran. So in this verse he has Noah being threatened with stoning, because again, this is integral to Islamic culture and the Islamic penal system. Just like crucifixion, or being immolated, being burned alive. These are things that are very much Islamic punishments in our day and age. These are things that these are punishments that you only find within Muslim culture. So the people who say that ISIS is not Islamic because they burn prisoners or crucify prisoners, it's simply contradicted by the facts and by the history of Islam and by the Quran itself. So in 118 it says, "Therefore judge thou between me and them with a just judgment, and deliver me and those who are with me of the believers." So we delivered him and those with him in the laden ark. And here it's referring to Noah and his family. And 120 it says, "Then we drowned the rest afterwards. Most surely there is a sign in this, but most of them do not believe. And most surely your Lord is the mighty, the merciful." Ad gave the lie to their apostles, and as I alluded to in another video, Ad and Samud, these are Arabic cities whose destruction created legends surrounding them, and Muhammad uses this as a way of demonstrating Allah's omnipotence and his punishment of people who do not follow Islam, even though it's very tenuous. This idea is basically just using, like he did in other parts of the Quran, using legends and certain historical artifacts in order to bolster his own cause. So in 123 it says, Ad gave the lie to the apostles when their brother Hud said to them, will you not guard against evil? Surely I'm a faithful apostle to you. So here again he talks about an Arabic legend, and I do not ask you any reward for it. Surely my reward is only with the Lord of the worlds. Do you build on every height a monument? Vain is it that you do. And this is particularly ironic because Muslims build enormous, what are called victory mosques. They did this whenever they would conquer a territory. Particularly, you see it in India when the Arab Muslim armies invaded and conquered what was called Hindustan, what's now Pakistan and India. They would erect gigantic mosques and just destroy every Hindu temple and idol. They would destroy it and replace it with victory mosques. And Robert Spencer describes this very well in his book, the History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. This was what they tried to do at the base of Ground Zero, erect a mosque in praise of the destruction of the World Trade Center by Al Qaeda. And there's something they do throughout in Tennessee, a a mosque being sponsored by Erdogan and the Turkish government, a gigantic, I forget how many acres, the acreage of land, but it's a gigantic mosque being erected in the middle of Nashville, I believe. So this idea, this is ironic considering this verse, "Do you build on every height a monument? Vain is it that you do," is particularly ironic when you consider Islam's proclivity to just build monuments, boasting about Islam every single place that Islam is. There's no country where Muslims have a significant presence where they have not built garish, ostentatious mosques in celebration of that fact. Even in Japan, where you have a very minuscule Muslim population, I think it's under 1%, and many of the Muslims there are from Middle Eastern countries, diplomats from Middle Eastern countries, and consular officials. Even there, you have mosques. So this idea that it's vain to build a monument is contradicted by the history of Islam itself and Muhammad and what his companions did after they were victorious in Arabia and the Middle East. So in 155, in 154, it says, "You are not but a mortal like ourselves, so bring a sign if you are one of the truthful." And again, this is a recurring theme throughout the Quran. Bring us a sign, and this is used by Muhammad as an excuse to not demonstrate his prophethood. He's continually greeted with skepticism, rightly so, because there's nothing in Muhammad's life that demonstrated that he was a prophet. He was a self-declared prophet in the same way as Joseph Smith or Mary Baker Eddy or Ellen G. White or a host of false prophets in the past. He was also a false prophet who assumed prophethood by himself. And in the Bible, of course, we know prophets are prophets, designated prophets by God himself. So you can't be a prophet unless you're given that prophethood by God. So people like Samuel or Elijah or Haggai or Obadiah. All of these people were prophets by virtue of the fact that they were given a revelation by God, which is something that did not happen to Muhammad. And there were even prophets like Jonah who didn't want to be prophets, who who fled, um, who kind of tried to flee their vocation, and yet were still prophets. So this prophet is not something that you can take. And in Deuteronomy, of course, it outlines a test for prophethood. If a prophet says something and it doesn't come to pass, then you can ignore them. And this is something that was the case with Muhammad. He made prophecies that did not come to pass. So by definition, by the definition of the Bible, he was a false prophet. So in 155 it says, he said, "This is a she camel. She shall have her portion of water, and have your portion of water on an appointed time, and do not touch her with evil, lest the punishment of a grievous day should overtake you." But they hamstrung her, then regretted. So the punishment overtook them. Most surely there is a sign in this, but most of them do not believe. And again, this is not a sign, what he describes here. And camels are pivotal to Islam, but it has nothing to do with God making them some sort of special or divine animal. It was simply the fact that um, camos were an integral part of Middle Eastern and Arabian culture, used for conveying things. They were kind of like the moving vans of 7th century Arabia. So they were also used for meat, for food, for clothing, which is why camels have such an important role in the Quran and in the Hadiths. And Muhammad even advises his followers to drink camel urine for their health, with it, which of course is just another indication that Muhammad did not understand science. But it continues. But they hamstrung her, then regretted. And it concludes, and most surely your Lord is the mighty, the merciful. Again, a completely a story, if you want to call it a story, devoid of context, inserted there, and then he moves on seamlessly to another point that has no connection to the previous statement. So in 60, it continues, the people of Lut gave the lie to the apostles when their brother Lut said to them, "Will you not guard against evil? Surely I am a faithful apostle to you." Now, Paul says, he describes Lot as righteous, and he says that he was grieved by what he saw in Sodom. But the idea that the people of Sodom were Lot's people is simply not true. And this is another demonstration of how Muhammad did not understand the Bible. He did not understand that Lot was a Hebrew, and he was the cousin of Abraham. They were Hebrews. They were one people. The people, even though that Lot was living, eventually he was living at the gate, in the gate of Sodom, and he was an advisor to Sodom. He was very much immersed in the affairs of Sodom, and this is one of the reasons Lot's family, most of his family, except for his daughters, died, because they didn't have a strong role model, a biblical um, a biblical guide to. In fact, his sons-in-law thought that he was mocking them when he warned them of the imminent destruction of Sodom. So he was very much much in tune with the people of Sodom, but that doesn't mean that they were his people. Literally, Lot was a Hebrew, even though he's not called Hebrew. He was a Jew. Lot was Jewish, and his people were Jews, even though he immersed himself in the culture of Sodom, and it was very very carnally minded in that way. But here in the Quran, he's describing the people of Sodom, not his family, but the actual his associates and his business partners and the people he lived with in Sodom as his people, literally. So again, Muhammad did not understand the Bible, and it continues with the story of the destruction of Sodom. And in 168, it said, he said, surely I am of those who utterly abhor your doing. My Lord, deliver me and my followers from what they do. So we delivered him and his followers all. And again, this is not an accurate rendering of what happened, except an old woman among those who remained behind. Then we utterly destroyed the others. So again, it doesn't even describe who this woman is. This woman was Lot's wife, who of course looked back onto Sodom and turned into a pillar of salt. But again, people who get their information about the Torah, the Pentateuch, or the Bible in general from the Quran are going to be very badly misinformed. This concept itself, that Lot was the one who interceded with God to not destroy him, is simply false. I mean, if you go back to if you go back to Genesis 19, there's a description of the angels coming, visiting Sodom, and Lot trying to prevent them from seeing how deeply corrupt and sinful Sodom is, and trying to protect them. But in the preceding chapter, you have Abraham bargaining with God and trying to get him to spare Sodom, and and 26, it's in 25 it says that be far from thee to do after this manner, so to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And he said, if I find there 40 and 5, I will not destroy it. And it continues on until verse 32, where it says, and he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet, but this once, peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way as soon as he had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. So Abraham is the one interceding for God, interceding for Lot and for the people of Sodom. But in the Quran, we have a description of Lot, a description of this, which makes you believe that Lot is the one interceding for for his people, when we know that Lot even tried to avoid leaving Sodom, and he didn't want to leave. And if you read Genesis 19, 20, you understand this better. And I would recommend that Muslims actually read Genesis so they understand the story. So in 195, again, it says in plain Arabic language, after describing things that are signs which aren't really signs. And in 196, and most surely the same as in the scriptures of the ancients, is it not a sign to them that the learned men of the Israelites know it? And if we had revealed it to any of the foreigners, so that he should have recited it to them, they would not have believed therein. Thus we have caused it to enter into the hearts of the guilty. And in 213 says, so call not upon another God of Allah, lest you be with those who are punished. And again, we have the idea of Muhammad not understanding who God is. He did not understand the difference between tritheism, the worship of three separate gods, and the idea of a trinity, which is the worship of one God, which is comprised of three persons within the Godhead. And you see this even in the Bible. You have you have the idea of a tetrarch, which is a ruler of four, or a ruler of a quarter. In other words, four subdivisions, and these were governors that would rule, four governors which would rule a nation subdivided into four separate things. And in the Bible, you have Herod referred to as a tetrarch. And after the death of Salome, you essentially had three rulers, which was three rulers of these divisions. And you have this in the Roman Republic, right before Caesar seized power, and his death and the victory of Augustus, and you have the Roman Empire. You have something called a triumvirate, which is three people ruling one government. So the concept of a trinity, of having three persons in one governing or ruling authority, is not a difficult concept to grasp intellectually. But Muhammad did not understand the difference between the Trinity and worshiping three separate gods, even though, as I explained earlier in the video, what Islam is essentially the worship of one false god, one god, in the context of a multitude of gods. He did not understand the idea of a trinity. Do not say three. Yeah, that's repeated throughout the Quran. So this is a concept that he just did not grasp. So this is a pretty long video, so I'll just wrap it up here. We're at the end of this surah, where it says, in 221, it says, "Shall I inform you of him upon whom the shaitans descend? They descend upon every lying, sinful one. They incline their ears, and most of them are liars. And as to the poets," and again, this shows you the kind of how incomprehensible the Quran is, because the surah is titled "The Poets," so you would assume that this is what the surah is about, but we don't get to the the rub of it until let me see, 4 lines before the end of the surah. We finally have the first mention of this. "And as to the poets, those who go astray follow them. Do they not see that they wander about bewildered in every valley, and that they say that which they do not do, except for those who believe and do good and remember Allah much and defend themselves after they are oppressed? And they who act unjustly shall know to what final place of turning they shall turn back to." And again, hi Inky and Scott. Thanks for joining. I'm just wrapping up here. So again, we have a combination of this soteriology, which is based on works, combined with an allusion to salvation by faith, but not really, because as I mean, for those of you who you've read the Bible, and you've read the New Testament, you've read the Pauline epistles, and you understand when he describes faith, he describes he describes salvation by grace through faith. Ye are saved, not of works, lest any man should boast. This is a concrete concept of the gospel, that you're saved by faith, that there's nothing you can do that could achieve your salvation. So even here, if there's an allusion to belief in Allah partially saving you, the fact that it's grounded in the ground in the context of doing works and doing works to achieve your salvation. That's a negation of the first part of that statement. The idea that you can be saved by faith, but you need to do works in order to achieve it. That simply makes a hash of this idea of salvation by grace through faith. Like, if you have to keep doing works, then it's not salvation by faith. It's rendered meaningless in essence. Anyway, that's just this video's a little long, but that's just Surah 26. The next Surah is the ant, which should be interesting. Surah 27. And then after a little bit, the surahs start to decrease in length, so the video should be a little bit shorter, hopefully. But I'm glad you all joined us. Andrew, Mary, Love and Light, Scott, all of you, Kimberly, all of you that are here, Enoch. I'm glad you joined us, and like I said, feel free to share this if you have Muslim friends or even non-Muslim friends who are interested in the Quran. Feel free to share these videos, and I'll see you next time.